Hello, and welcome to Cogito Ergo Pod, the show where we discuss, delve, and dissect theology, philosophy, mysticism, and the esoteric. I'm your host, Daniel, and as ever, I'm so glad you're here. Before we dive into the deep end today, a quick reminder as always, if you enjoy our deep dives into the weird, the wonderful, and the profound, please hit that follow or subscribe button on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps the show. And if you want to keep the conversation going throughout the week and the weeks beyond, come find us on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube. We are Cogito Ergo Pod on all platforms where we post bite-sized theology, historical facts, and behind-the-scenes content. Today, we are tackling a topic that is profoundly human, highly sensitive, and arguably more relevant today than ever before: mental illness and mental health. When we read ancient texts, we have to remember that they didn't have words like schizophrenia, clinical depression, bipolar disorder, or PTSD. Instead, they used the language of their time: heavy hearts, evil spirits, demons, or thorns in the flesh. But if we strip away the ancient vocabulary, what we find are stark, unflinching, and deeply compassionate portrayals of human psyche under unimaginable stress. Today, we are going to trace the history of mental anguish through the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, the New Testament, and the Christian Apocryphal texts. We'll look at dates, the people, and where you can find them in your own Bible. Please note we are discussing depression, trauma, and suicidal ideation, so please listen with care. Also, as this week is Mental Health Awareness Week, I felt it even more important to highlight that some of the best known figures from the Bible face challenges like you and I. Let's begin. Our first stop is the 11th century BCE. This was the dawn of the Israelite monarchy. We are looking at King Saul, the first king of Israel, whose story is found in 1 Samuel. Around 1047 BCE, Saul takes the throne, but the pressure breaks him. In 1 Samuel 16:14, the text says, "Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him." Modern psychologists and biblical scholars, looking back at Saul's symptoms, his intense paranoia, his homicidal rages against David, and his crippling, debilitating lows, often point to severe bipolar disorder or severe clinical depression with psychotic features. And what's fascinating here is the ancient world's response to it. In 1 Samuel 16:23, his servants bring in a young shepherd boy named David to play the lyre for the king. Whenever the music played, relief would come to Saul. He would feel better. This is one of the earliest recorded instances of musical therapy in human history, and one I can strongly relate to. Moving forward to the 9th century BCE, we meet Elijah. Elijah is one of the greatest prophets in the Hebrew Bible, a man who called down fire from heaven. But in 1 Kings 19, Elijah experiences what would today be called severe burnout and suicidal ideation. Running for his life from Queen Jezebel, Elijah collapses under a solitary broom tree in the desert. In 1 Kings 19:4, he prays, "I have had enough, Lord, take my life." He is totally depleted. But look at the divine response. God doesn't scold him for lacking faith. God doesn't preach at him. God sends an angel to give him a hot meal, gives him a long nap, wakes him up for a second meal, and then speaks to him in a gentle whisper. It is a profoundly physiological and psychological approach to depression. Sleep, eat, and find a quiet space. Finally, for the Old Testament, we have to mention King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, reigning around 605 to 562 BCE. In the book of Daniel, chapter 4, this mighty, arrogant emperor suffers a severe psychotic break. He is driven away from people, eats grass like cattle, and his hair grows like eagles' feathers. Today, psychiatrists identify this as a rare psychological condition called boanthropy or clinical lycanthropy, where a human genuinely believes they have transformed into an animal. The text explicitly notes that after a period of time, Nebuchadnezzar's sanity had restored, Daniel 4:36, showing a remarkable ancient understanding of mental illness as a temporary, curable state rather than a permanent curse. We are now entering the intertestamental period, the centuries between Old and New Testaments. If you have a Catholic or Orthodox Bible, you have the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical books. We are going to look at a book first that I've covered in a previous episode, the Book of Tobit, written around the 3rd or 2nd century BCE. This book offers one of the most poignant looks at concurrent mental health crises. In Tobit, chapter 3, we have two characters who have never met, living in different cities, experiencing total psychological collapse on the exact same day. First, there is Tobit, an older, righteous man who has been suddenly blinded by bird droppings and is subsequently mocked by his own wife. His trauma and loss of agenda drive him into a deep clinical depression. He prays, "Command that I be released from this life, for it is better for me to die than to live." Tobit 3:6. On that exact same day, in the city of Ecbatana, a young woman named Sarah is dealing with immense trauma. She has been married 7 times, and every single time a demon named Asmodeus has killed her husband on their wedding night. Her maids cruelly mock her, accusing her of being a murderer. Sarah goes to an upstairs room to hang herself. She reconsiders only because it would break her father's heart, and instead prays, "Lord, command that I be released from the earth." Tobit 3:13. The beauty of this text is that heaven hears both of their prayers of absolute desperation at the exact same time. God dispatches Archangel Raphael, whose name literally translates to God heals. Raphael acts as a divine therapist and guide, orchestrating events so that Tobit's blindness is cured and Sarah is freed from torment and marries Tobit's son. It is a stunning, hopeful narrative about surviving trauma and the validity of crying out when you are at the end of your rope. As we now cross into the 1st century CE, the cultural understanding of mental illness in the Greco-Roman and Jewish worlds was heavily intrinsically tied to the spiritual realm. First, let's look at the Gerasene Demoniac, found in Mark 5:1-20. Jesus steps off a boat and is met by a man possessed by a legion of demons. If we look at the man's symptoms, he lives in the tombs, isolation. He cries out day and night, mania and or anguish, and he cuts himself with stones, self-harm. We see a man suffering from profound, violent psychosis or severe trauma. The community's response was to chain him up, which failed. But Jesus' response is entirely different. He doesn't chain him, he heals him. After the encounter, the locals find the man sitting there, dressed and in his right mind. Mark 5:15. It's a powerful testament to restoring dignity to those marginalized by their mental afflictions. We also have to talk about the Apostle Paul, writing around 55 CE. In 2 Corinthians 12:7-9, Paul writes about a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. He begs God 3 times to take it away, but God says, "My grace is sufficient for you." While some scholars think this was a physical ailment, like failing eyesight, a vast number of theologians and psychologists believe Paul was describing chronic depression, severe anxiety, or PTSD from his years of being persecuted, beaten, and imprisoned. It shows that even the foundational architect of early Christianity lived with a chronic, unhealing affliction, and yet he was entirely beloved and used by the divine. But perhaps the most profound example of mental anguish in the entire biblical canon comes from Jesus himself in the Garden of Gethsemane. In Matthew 26:38, Jesus tells his friends, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." In the Gospel of Luke 22:44, the psychological pressure is so severe that Jesus experiences hematidrosis, a documented, though rare, medical condition where extreme anxiety and stress cause the capillaries around the sweat glands to rupture, resulting in sweating drops of blood. Think about the theological implications of this. Christian tradition claims that Jesus is God incarnate. This means that experiencing crippling anxiety, panic attacks, and crushing death-wishing sorrow is not a sin. It is not a sign of a lack of faith. It is something that the divine itself experienced and validated. Now, let's go a bit deeper into the hidden books of early Christianity, texts written between the 1st and 5th centuries that didn't make the final cut of the New Testament, but were widely read. In the 2nd century CE, we find a text called the Shepherd of Hermas. It was incredibly popular in the early church. The author, Hermas, introduces a concept called double-mindedness and a spirit he calls gloom or sadness. In Mandate 10, Hermas describes how gloom is the sister of doubt and ill temper. He writes that gloom crushes the Holy Spirit. This is a sophisticated early psychological observation. He notes that being gloomy isn't just a bad mood, it's a state that disconnects you from your spiritual life and your community. The text suggests that the cure is cheerfulness and prayer, but it acknowledges gloom is a specific, oppressive force that must be wrestled with, a proto-diagnosis of what we might call chronic despondency or dysthemia. Around the same time, we have the Acts of Paul and Thecla, written around the late 2nd century CE. Thecla is a young woman who, after hearing the Apostle Paul speak, enters a state of what some scholars call religious mania or ecstatic trauma. She sits at her window for 3 days, refusing to eat or speak, fixated entirely on a new reality. While the text frames this as a spiritual awakening, it also vividly portrays the psychological shock of a paradigm shift and the subsequent social alienation and trauma she suffers as her family and community try to execute her for her choices. It highlights the madness often attributed to those who deviate from societal norms for their beliefs. When we dissect these texts, from King Saul's depression to Elijah's burnout, from Sarah's trauma to Jesus' panic in the Garden of Gethsemane, from Paul's challenges to Thecla's defiance, we see a thread. The Bible does not shy away from mental illness. It doesn't tell people to just pray it away or smile. It meets them in the dirt, under the broom tree, and in the tombs. However, this is not an exhausted list. There are many examples of St. Paul suffering throughout his letters. I haven't even mentioned Job and the challenges he faced when the Satan and God took away everything he had in life. There are many more examples to be explored, but this is just some examples to get you started. If you are struggling with your mental health, please know that you are in good, historical, and even holy company. Reach out to a professional, talk to someone you trust, and know that you are not alone. Thank you so much for joining me today on Cogito Ergo Pod. If you found this episode meaningful, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review the show on your podcast platform of choice. It is the best way to support independent creators such as myself. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Simply search Cogito Ergo Pod and you can join the community and let me know your thoughts on today's episode and any other episodes. I've been your host, Daniel. Until next time, keep delving, keep dissecting, and above all, take care of your mind and be kind to yourself.